All right, everybody, welcome back. Bio Bros Episode 5. This one, we're going to be talking about Latin names or scientific names, what in the world those mean, how to interpret them, why we even use them, and all of that. No guest this week, just me and Alex. Uh, so, we're going to get started in this one. I'm taking a bit of the lead over here today. I have a bunch of notes on all of this, and then Alex is just going to clarify a bit things I have to say, stop me when I get going too much, and ask some questions along the way.
And I'll tell him to
So,
speak English.
yeah, most of my talking today is gonna be in Latin, very nerdy. Uh, so, scientific names in general, what are they? So they use a process called binomial nomenclature, so bi meaning two, and nomenclature is just a word for naming things. And that is the system we've been using for quite some time now, and that's where you'll see the, like, Tyrannosaurus rex has those 2 names in it. That's the binomial nomenclature, and we'll go into what each of those parts would mean in a bit here, but very useful rather than just using common names. So, the example I like to use is crayfish versus crawdad. Depending where you're at in the world, people will call the same little freshwater lobster-looking guy a different word, and the scientific names and Latin names, same thing. You'll hear me interchange those. Or what cuts all that nonsense out. So we know we're talking about the same thing, right? If I say crayfish and Alex says crawdad, we'll be arguing, no, that's a crayfish, no, it's a crawdad. And in reality, it's a scientific name of sorts. It's this genus, that species. And so that cuts all the nonsense out. It's why we use them. And it really just clarifies everything. So now we'll
Just
get
to
into a
clarify,
little, yeah,
oh,
keep going.
just to clarify, it is crawdad.
Yeah, so see, we can argue about all this all the time, and especially, language barriers, that's another thing too, is in different parts of the world, people speak different languages, which means they call the same thing different words, and that causes a ton of confusion. If you ever watched, River Monsters, it's a good example of this one. He goes to different countries and he says, "Have you seen this fish?" And then they're all call it a different name than what he would call it, and then there's that little bit of detective work where he's like, "Oh, oh, they're talking about this," and then they pop that little graphic up and it has the scientific name in there. Uh, so now we'll get into a little bit of history. Aristotle actually was the first one to start making a system for identifying and naming animals in a uniform way. So back to Greece again. I know we did that, I think it was last week, when we were talking about the Greeks keeping fish in ponds, saltwater. We need to do a whole episode about that. Really interesting stuff these guys are doing. Very, very ahead of their time. So he's the first one to kind of
Yeah,
try to do
definitely.
it. Um, and then a little for a good while until 1700s, there was a few different systems that people were trying to do and work and just really wasn't working. One guy was out here trying to classify everything algebraically. It was some nonsense, really. And then this guy, Carl Linnaeus from Sweden, came along and really solidified our binomial nomenclature that we use today. And that was in the 1700s. He was born in 1707, so around that time. I think he died in, like, late 1700s, so worked on that for most of his career. Okay, and then a little broader, so we don't just show up with a scientific name, we don't just make it up. There's a whole you've seen this pyramid deal that goes on in every science classroom ever is domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species, and then there's a bonus one everyone forgets about, subspecies. So that's our pyramid of knowledge, if you will, where we group everything into there. So domain is the biggest group, and pretty much there's only, I believe, 3 domains. This is off the top of my head because 'cause we're mostly gonna be focusing on genus, species, because that's where most of the cool action gets done here. And then it goes into kingdom, and that's where, like, Animalia, Plantae, all that stuff will be in there. So, basically animals, plants, bacteria, the really, really broad stuff. And then class gets more specific, order more specific, genus, species, subspecies, family. Actually, forgot family in there. Family's in there. Don't worry about that. That was misspeak on me. Uh, so we're gonna focus mostly on genus species. So, genus is what most people call family. That is not correct, but it is the family, right? So all of these things are the same. They're all one genus. So if we were to use plants for an example, it'd be philodendron, right? So you'll hear people say the philodendron family. Not correct. The family is Araceae that covers all aroids, including things like monsteras. The genus is philodendron. And then the species is the second word, and that's the one that really differentiates it. So I think of it how we think of like first and last names, just backwards, like how they do it in Japan and some other countries, is your last name, your family name, right? The name that all of you have is whatever, Smith, we'll say. And then your individual personal name would be John. I'm John Smith, and that's my sister, Sue Smith. So genus, all very, very closely related. Most of the time, they can hybridize with each other. And then species is that exact guy right there. All
Yeah,
right.
it's really interesting stuff. And it's always interesting too with the Latin names. I know a lot of times they have like a meaning behind them too, other than just the species and family. Like the Latin words mean something pertaining to the animal.
Yep. And then I have that written down right here too. And we're going to go into some of the really popular ones. So we use the language of Latin for the most part. I know some people freak out. They're like, taxonomy's Greek. It's Greek. Yeah, but mostly we use Latin. They call them Latin names. The language used is Latin. Which is actually kind of nice using a dead language because it's universal. That means everybody who's into it is learning this one thing, and it's actually kind of nice. Kind of breaks away language barriers. So general rules are pronunciation. Nobody really cares, except for a couple. I think it matters a little bit, just because you might actually be accidentally mispronouncing a real person's name, and that's kind of annoying when that happens. So the suffix, so end of the word, ensis, E-N-S-I-S. If you ever see a species name that ends in ensis, it means it's from a place. I use the example of Nepenthes trusmatiensis. It's a naturally occurring hybrid, really, really cool, from Mount Trusmati. So it's Trusmati ensis. You'll see a lot of things that end in Madagascarensis too, from Madagascar. Very similar to Spanish, how things are a little backwards, but makes sense, right? Um, that's one of the big ones. Ensis, know it's from there. That one's really cool if you want to impress your friends. You know, you go to the zoo and you read the tag, and be like, I can guess where that's from. The other one, this is the biggest one everyone messes up, is a little pet peeve of mine, and I'm a little pretentious, being like, "Ooh, I'm so much better. I know how to pronounce all these things." But really easy. Two eyes or one eye. Normally, you'll see two eyes. One eye is a little less common. Is not pronounced e like that, or you'll see people pronounce like that. It's pronounced I. The both of the I's are EI, and then one I is just I. And that means it's named after a person and specifically a man. So we'll go back to that Smith example I was using. That'll probably be our last name for the most placeholder last name. Is Smithy I. So it'd be Smith, S-M-I-T-H, I-I. That'd be Smithy I. Popular species in there would be Gecko Smithy I. Is a green-eyed gecko. Our one of our guests, Harrison, he has one very cool lizard actually. Now, if there's named after a man, there's a word for named after a woman, EA, but it's backwards. It's a written AE, pronounced EA. That means named after a woman. And that example, for real life example, is Anthurium Carla Blackiae. Carla Black, very cool lady, does a lot of cool things. We might have to do an episode on her, just whole history, very cool. But EA, or you'll see things that are like Alicia, named after Alice. So those are pretty much the only ones that I have any sort of complaint about mispronunciation, just because those are real things. Like you might be accidentally mispronouncing a real person's name directly to them. So I'd pronounce try to pronounce those ones the name and then just the suffix correct. Those ones are pretty easy. And then there's a few more that are just nice to see around and give a little bit of context, is oides is one of those, OIDES. So that means the likeness usually of another species. So if you see something, I'm using a lot of plant examples, guys. Sorry, plants are just easier scientific names off my head. I don't even know a lot of plant common names really. Um, is Heliumphora sarracenoides. So Sarracenia are the North American pitcher plants. Heliumphora are South American pitcher plants. So Heliumphora sarracenoides means that this Heliumphora is like a Sarracenia. Uh, then one other quick tiny pet peeve that I have to complain about a little bit is when people just swap the order of genus and species. If I would say like, "Oh, that's the Heliumphora sarracenoides," they'd be like, "Oh, the Sarracenia Heliumphora." You're like, "No, no, no, when we put them in the order for a reason, don't just flop them around." Uh, or, the people do it in philodendrons and stuff all the time, like common house plants. They switch up genus and species. It's like, "No, it's the other way around." Uh, and then one more other little housekeeping thing on here is when you're writing them, always capitalize the genus, never capitalize the species. Technically, you're supposed to italicize and underline too. Biggest thing is just capitalize genus, species is not capitalized.
Hmm. I actually never knew that.
Yeah, there's a lot of weird rules and things, and really they don't matter for the most part, like, just a couple of them. Like, I say don't capitalize the species just as a general rule. It lets you kinda know that they go together, right? It's like you
Yeah.
capitalize the first letter of a sentence and then, like, proper nouns. It just lets you know they go together, you're not talking about 2 separate genera. Actually,
Yeah.
that's another point I should clarify. It's not genuses, it's genera. Uh, that's
Hmm.
multiple of a genus is genera. You say there's 10 genera in that family.
Interesting. I know, like, when we were talking about before they started recording about, I was telling you about how I just set up my Apolopus species Columbia, which, um, m onto, like, the Latin names, like, having a meaning behind them other than just, like, who found the species and things like that. Like, Apolopus, uh, has when it's broken down, is basically from the root words of Apollo and pus. Haplo meaning simple and pus being foot, so it's a simple foot um, tarantula, which a lot of Latin names tend to do that. They tend to like take the root words and then combine them to be like have a meaning towards what the animal looks like or what they might be like if they're a giant lizard or something like that, which I always
Yeah, they
found really
definitely
cool.
yeah, they most of them, since like I said in the very top of the episode, they're based on Latin, and so they do have a real meaning. They really do, unless they're one of those examples, like I said, where it's named after a person or place. And in that case, obviously, it's whatever language you want. Uh, like, there's a kind of running joke between some of us in the group. There is a former friend of ours, not anymore, uh, who tried to tell us one time that Veitchii, named after Sir Veitch, German man, was well, not German man, actually, was pronounced Weechii because that's how it is in Latin, but it's Veitchii because it's his name, and his name is pronounced that way, so it's kind of a running joke. And, like, he tried to tell us that all sorts of V's and W's were pronounced differently, even though they were pronounced how they should be in their language. So, very funny, actually.
Remember that argument?
Yeah, that was hilarious. I mean, especially looking back on that one's funny.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, and then another thing you might see is species abbreviated. It's SP and then a period. That just means species. So you might say, like, a Pagona species. So, I mean, it's some sort of bearded dragon. We don't know what kind.
Yeah, and
And
it'll
then
happen too with like again the Hapalopus species. subspecies Columbia. A lot of times when you see it written, it's Hapalopus sp. Columbia because they don't have the specific species. They just know it's found. This one was found in Colombia, or is originally from the Colombian area, but
Yeah.
they're not
The
exactly sure.
Yeah, just those little placeholder names so that way we know what we're talking about, but not necessarily getting lost. That's another important thing that you'll see too is subspecies. So some things are in species complexes. Usually I'm personally not a fan of species complexes. I think they're done incorrectly, like a little hastily and people are grouping things in. But you'll see I'll use the red tail boas, boa constrictor, constrictor, or boa constrictor imperator. They have a double name. That means they're a subspecies. It means they're the same, but just enough different. We're gonna put a little footnote on there and be like, "Yeah, he's different, just a bit." Usually, I think most of those can be split into 2 separate species, but there are cases with things like the boa constrictors or red tail boa that they are useful.
Yeah, and these names and stuff are changing all the time because scientists are changing if a species is a species or a subspecies, or if a subspecies becomes its own species. I mean, it's always changing. Um,
Yeah, it's a disaster.
yeah,
Always, constantly, things are changing.
yeah, but I mean that's how science is. It's never the same.
Yeah, which is what's really cool about it too. Lots of people can see and make all the changes. It's fun to keep track of. It just happened with a ton of popular houseplants. Um, Calathea, was it Calathea that basically got eradicated? There's, like, no Calathea anymore, and there used to be, like,
No,
tons of Calathea,
I
or
don't
is it the
think
other
it's
way around?
Calathea. It was Maranta. I think went into Calathea. It's either Maranta became Calathea or Calathea became Maranta. I can't remember which. Because it was like
Yeah,
the prairie
but
plants were separate
yeah,
from Calathea,
and
but now I
now
think
they're
they
the
combined
same.
them.
Now there's all the Geognathus that used to be close to them too. It's always changing,
Oh
so
yeah,
it
I mean
does
a
get
good
a little
a,
annoying.
a good not plant example, but animal example of something that just changed that was really big recently. Was with North American uh rat snakes or Pantherophis. Um, because they changed it from like the eastern rat snake is now separate. There's like a gray rat snake now, and then there's the eastern, but then there's also the um like the Texas rat snake is no longer a Texas rat snake, it's a western rat snake now. They changed that whole genus around recently and like combined a bunch and separated some. It was a whole thing that happened in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I believe that's gonna happen with Crotalus scuculatus or the Mojave rattlesnake because their range is insane, and you can see all the way from United States of America all the way down in South America. They're completely different. Like the ones we have here in Arizona, are nothing like the Scuculatus from down in Mexico that they're so different that
Even
most people don't even call them Scuculatus or Mojave, they call them Salvinite. You're more likely to hear people say Crotalus salvini than Crotalus scuculatus salvini. There's a picture on my personal Instagram. I'll try to repost it on my story when this goes live of me holding one, and then I'll salvini, and then I'll post a one that we have here in Arizona next to each other, and you'll see like why subspecies matters and why I think that that species is gonna fall apart and split into 5 or 6 different species.
yeah, I mean even like the ones in Arizona compared to the ones in West Texas look completely different sometimes too. So I mean it's they just got to do
Yeah,
studies and stuff, and eventually they'll probably split them all up.
yeah, I think they will, but I'm not a taxonomist. I'm just picky.
Yeah.
Right, and then, Alex, what's something else I either skipped over or didn't go into deep enough? Because I feel like
Um,
I ran through a lot of things fairly quickly.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. I do think that, like, again, this is something that you could learn all the Latin names you want to, and it could change next year. It's not something that you want to take to heart if you don't fully understand every single Latin name. It's a thing that's like people of all languages can understand what that Latin name is and what you were talking about and what specific animal you were talking about when you use that Latin name. But again, it is also constantly changing. And they're combining and separating species and genuses all the time.
Yeah, it's very some things it's more important than for others.
Yes.
I will say that. Like crested gecko, everyone knows what you're saying when you say crested gecko. Everyone knows you're saying leopard gecko, ball python, like the really, really common stuff everyone knows about. And then the less species per genus, it matters less and less too. Like some things will be like monotypic genera, where there's only one species in that genus. Usually that one's common name is just its genus name, but then it matters a little less. But when you're getting into, like, plants where there's hundreds of species
Hmm.
per genus, it then it starts to matter. Like I said a bit, I don't even really know a lot of plant common names just because their common names are their scientific names. Like, you'll go into the grocery store and see Monstera adansonii, and that's what it's labeled as. That's what the common person knows it. You don't even have to be a nerd. It's like, "What's that?" "It's an adansonii."
Yeah, and another thing that's also important for is like when you're getting into like inverts and things like that, because most inverts, there are a few like the GBB, which is my green bottle blue, which I'm not even gonna try and say that scientific name because it is a mouthful. But certain ones like that, and like the OBT, which is the orange baboon tarantula, those have common names. But you get into certain things like um, I fell upon a Faunapelma hensi, which is there's about 500 common names for it. A lot of people call them the Texas brown. They are also called the Oklahoma brown or the Missouri brown. But like the other thing too is you get into there is 10 different spiders that all look the same. So calling them this brown doesn't say what they are, but when you say a Faunapelma hensi, that means I am talking about this specific species and genus of spider, a Faunapelma hensi. Um, and the same, that's even with the widows. There's all different widows. There's brown widows. There's like 3 or 4 different black widows. There's different black widows all over the world because like the redback spider in Australia is actually a black widow. Um, and that's when you were talking about that kind of stuff too. Specific genus and species names are important because that is defining what species you are talking about, and it's not just oh, it's a widow, and it's like okay, which widow? Because it could be 500 other ones, and they also could all have different types of venom. They could all like not everyone in the same genus has the same type of venom, so there's that too when it comes to like venomous snakes and things like that too.
Yeah, that's, actually part of the rules for venomous snakes if you have, like, a zoo permit or something, and really what you should be doing even if you don't live in a place where it's permitless, you'll notice this next time you go to the zoo, is all the tags for venomous snakes have common name, scientific, and what kind of antivenom they require, if there is one. And that's where, like, common name, now most people in your region will know that this is a western diamondback rattlesnake, right? I can say that everybody, at least in my part of the woods, knows what that is. But if they're struggling with that, we can be like, no, Crotalus atrox. They're like,
Hmm.
oh, that's the right one right there. Because, like Alex was saying, the venom is a little different and things can change. Now, this isn't true. The same antivenoms, Crofab and Antivip, work for all the vipers that we have in Arizona. and I believe 99% sure both of those work for everything in North America that's a viper, so none of our coral snakes.
Yeah,
But
which I mean,
the yeah,
but still,
it honestly, you're not getting bit by a coral snake. Like, if
no,
we're
you have
being
to
really
try.
for real, you have to really try. Those dudes do not want anything to do with a person,
Well, that and
and they're small
even
enough
if
they
they
can hide.
do, and even if they do bite you, they have to chew to envenomate.
Yeah, to at least get a good one in there.
Yeah, but
But,
then
like, the
if they
Mojave
do,
rattlesnakes will have a different venom depending on what they ate and where they're from.
well, yeah, I mean,
Very
it's and you get into things like there's copperheads and stuff like copperhead versus rattlesnake. They have different venom. One has hemotoxic, one has neurotoxic. I mean, there's all different types of venom that attack different parts of your body. So knowing what species it is, specifically species and genus, then you will know specifically what venom they have as well.
yeah, and it's just nice to it's a kind of a fun game too, like, I've actually really enjoyed the process of learning more about the, like, nerdy side of how things are named, because it's kinda fun. You'll see common names, and the common names are just the English translation of the Latin names sometimes. Well, actually, a good bit of the time, they're just the translation. So you can have a pretty informed guess of what the scientific name is gonna be just based on that. It's kind of a fun game. I do it to my mom sometimes, like, she'll show me something, and she's like, "Oh, look, they did this and that," and I'll spit out what I think the scientific name is. Most of the time, it's a guess, but I'm usually right, just because it'll be like, "Oh, this is Smith's whatever," and I'll be like, "Oh, I bet it's a something or other Smithy eye," and she's like, "How'd you know?" Because of that. I know the suffix 2 eyes means named after, so when you flip it around to a common name and it's Smith's whatever, you know that it's probably gonna be named after Smith.
Yeah, and it also it comes important, like you were saying with plants, because some plants have names that completely mislead you as to what species and genus is from. The best example I can think of currently would be the mini monstera, which is not a monstera at all. It is actually Rhaphidophora tetrasperma.
Yeah, not even
And
from the same place and, like, at all.
nope,
They're
it's just because their
very
leaf structure
different.
looks slightly similar, so they called it a mini monstera, even though it's not related in any way, shape, and form to any monstera.
Yeah, so and a lot of that stuff, like monsteras, like, people have those in their house. That's a genus right there. When they say, "I have a monstera," you're like, "Okay." You know you have something in that group, and they'll kinda share similar traits for the most part. And then you can go, what kind? And the most common ones are deliciosa, the big one I'm sure everybody's seen before, and then Adansonii, the ones smaller ones that actually look more like a vine. Everybody has those. Those are in all sorts of grocery stores. Really good plants, by the way. Two of my favorite house plants.
Oh yeah. And they have good variants and stuff too. Like I have Deliciosa High Constellation, which is just a variegated cultivation of Deliciosa, but it's a very pretty plant, very flecked with lots of variegation and stuff, and they range in variation and stuff too.
Actually, that's another good point to talk about. You just brought up. You have Monstera deliciosa Thai constellation. So it has a second name, and that would be like a cultivar or morph name. So a cultivar will always be a very specific clone of a plant. That's how it works. It has to be a clone, has to be that exact one to be a cultivar. But there's also you can put a little distinction due to phenotypic or physical traits. And so you can have like uh whatever, and then it'll have a descriptor of it. And so you'll know that this is slightly different, even though it's not a subspecies. Like I have actually, that's a bad example. I was gonna use my Nepenthes ampullaris black miracle, but that is a true cultivar. Uh, you'll see, like, a lot of animals, they'll say, "Oh, these ones are from Colombia," or, red-eyed tree frogs. The ones from Costa Rica don't have that blue on them, so they will be distinguished based off of where they're from. So it
Yeah,
would say if there were the normal ones have blue on them, but the Costa Rican ones do not. So if you were to see them in like a pet shop or something and they were labeled scientifically, it would be Let's see if I can get this one. Agallichinus calidris, Costa Rica. So you
Hmm.
know, even though they're the exact same species, you know he's from Costa Rica, so he's not gonna have that blue.
Yeah.
Or you'll see it in morphs a lot too, like albino or hypo, which is short for hypomelanistic, which means no melanin. Um, Actually, I'll talk about this one a little bit because it also you'll see it in some scientific names where like hypo means no, hyper means a lot. So if you see something that's hypomelanistic, no melanin, hypermelanistic, a lot of melanin.
Mhm.
So then that'll affect the colors and whatnot of the creature.
Yeah, it's tied more into genetics than it is the actual. Well, sometimes it's tied into the location, but it's more tied into the genetics and like coloration and attributes of the animal.
Yeah, if for some reason a descriptor is needed because these ones are a little different, they'll toss one on there. Like occasionally you'll see it in plants where they'll type like Monstera forsythiana alba variegata, which is just a little excessive. But it just means that it's a variegated version of this Monstera forsythiana. So, quick wrap, this is gonna be a shorter episode, I think, is binomial nomenclature, 2 names, genus, species, those are the biggest ones you're gonna see. And that's how you'll be able to identify everything. Everything within a genus is very closely related. Think like you and your family, and then a species is you individually within your family. And I'm counting your family as like your cousins and everything too, like your big extended family. Everyone who would share that same last name. That's that's your um, that's your genus, and everybody's individual first name would be the species. Uh, and then remember the ensis, from somewhere, 2 I's, pronounced EI, named after a man, EA, written AE, very annoying, but I always spell it wrong, but it is like that, is named after a lady, and then oides, OIDES, is likeness of another species. Those are the biggest ones that I see the most of and are very helpful in determining these things are named and what those names mean. And then just other little tips is it is in Latin, so if you speak English, which I assume you do if you're listening to this, you will be able to almost pick apart the words because we have a lot of those roots, and especially if you're multilingual, if you speak Spanish too, you gotta pick out the roots, like sphero, sphere, right? Spheres are round, so if you see it says sphero, probably means round. And then that's about it for the scientific names, how those work. Like I said, a little quicker episode, a little higher intensity, but it's good.
Yeah. Hope everyone enjoyed the episode. If y'all do enjoy the episodes and enjoying this podcast, please give us a like and a follow over on Instagram as well as here on YouTube. We would like to grow this community, and so more people can listen to this podcast that y'all are hopefully enjoying, and we can get a nice, good community that we would like to build. So again, if you would just leave us a like and a follow. Um, I think that's all for today.
And we'll see you guys next week.